Imagine this. You are a lookout aboard a Japanese destroyer, cutting through the black waters of Guadalcanal on the night of December 11th, 1942. The Solomon Islands campaign has raged for months, but tonight you are confident. Your vessel is 300 feet of steel and firepower, armed with torpedoes that can sink a battleship and guns that can tear apart anything smaller than a cruiser. You have just successfully escorted supply drums toward the island, and now you are withdrawing at high speed. Then you hear it. A low rumble at first, like distant thunder but growing louder. Not from above, from the water. Your training tells you this is impossible. Small craft cannot operate at night in these contested waters. Small craft cannot threaten a destroyer of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Your doctrine, refined over decades, dismisses such vessels as nothing more than coastal nuisances, irrelevant to the decisive naval battles that will determine the fate of the Pacific. But the rumble becomes a roar. 30 seconds later, phosphorescent wakes streak toward your position at 40 knots. Wooden boats, barely 80 feet long, have just fired 4 Mark 8 torpedoes at your destroyer. You realize, in that final moment, that your Navy's fundamental assumptions about warfare were catastrophically wrong. The doctrine that guided every decision, every deployment, every strategic calculation has failed you. The question is not whether these devil boats can sink you. The question is why no one in the entire Imperial Japanese Navy ever believed they would try. Why did Japanese destroyers never imagine that American patrol torpedo boats would attack at 40 knots? What fatal blindness in their naval thinking led them to dismiss these wooden marvels as irrelevant? And how did this miscalculation cost them the Pacific War? To understand why the Imperial Japanese Navy failed to anticipate American PT boat tactics, we must first understand the very foundation of Japanese naval thinking. In 1905, at the Battle of Tsushima, the Japanese fleet achieved one of the most decisive naval victories in history. They annihilated the Russian Baltic Fleet in a single day of combat in the waters near Japan. That victory became the cornerstone of everything that followed. The Japanese called their strategic doctrine Kantai Kessen, which translates to Decisive Battle Doctrine. The concept was simple, elegant, and ultimately fatal. Japanese naval planners believed that wars would be won through a single, overwhelming confrontation between battle fleets in the open ocean. They studied the writings of American naval historian Alfred Thayer Mahan, who argued that control of the seas required dominant battleship forces capable of destroying enemy fleets in pitched battles. The Japanese embraced this philosophy completely. Under Kantai Kessen, the Imperial Japanese Navy designed every aspect of its force structure around this singular vision. They built the largest battleships in history, the Yamato and Musashi, each weighing 63,000 tons and mounting 9 18-inch guns. They developed the Type 93 torpedo, nicknamed the Long Lance, which could travel at 48 knots for 22 miles with a warhead containing nearly 1,100 pounds of explosives. They trained their sailors for years in gunnery, torpedo tactics, and night combat, all oriented toward the moment when they would meet the American fleet somewhere in the Western Pacific and destroy it in one apocalyptic engagement. This doctrine shaped not just their weapons and tactics, but their entire strategic mindset. Japanese planners assumed the United States Navy would steam westward across the Pacific to relieve the Philippines after the outbreak of war. Along the way, Japanese submarines would whittle down the American fleet. Japanese land-based bombers would strike from island bases. Japanese cruisers and destroyers would conduct night torpedo attacks. By the time the two battle fleets met, the Americans would be weakened, far from their supply bases, and vulnerable to annihilation by superior Japanese gunnery and torpedo firepower. Everything outside this framework was dismissed as secondary. Coastal defense, convoy protection, anti-submarine warfare, logistics, attrition warfare, these were footnotes in Japanese naval planning. The decisive battle was all that mattered. Small craft, wooden boats, patrol vessels that could not stand in the line of battle were considered naval dust, unworthy of serious consideration. Motor torpedo boats, which had proven effective in World War I and which other navies were developing, were viewed by Japanese strategists as ineffective in the heavy seas near Japan where the decisive battle would occur. This was not mere arrogance. It was institutional blindness born from a doctrine that had become dogma. The Japanese Navy had won at Tsushima by concentrating overwhelming force at a decisive point. They believed this formula would work again. They could not conceive that the next war might be fought differently. that it might be a grinding campaign of attrition in coastal waters and island chains where small, fast boats could matter more than battleships. The Americans, however, were about to show them a very different kind of warfare. While Japanese admirals dreamed of decisive fleet engagements, American engineers were building something entirely different. The PT boats that arrived in the Pacific in 1942 represented a radical departure from traditional naval thinking. They were designed not for glory, but for flexibility, not for decisive battle, but for persistent harassment. The standard American PT boat measured 78 to 80 feet in length and displaced only 50 to 56 tons. Built primarily from mahogany planking, they carried no armor. Their primary weapons were four 21-inch Mark 8 torpedoes, each with a 466-pound warhead. But their real weapon was speed. Powered by three Packard marine engines derived from aircraft power plants, these boats could reach 40 knots, sometimes even 45 knots in calm seas. They could accelerate from stealth to full sprint in seconds, launch their torpedoes at close range, and disappear into the darkness before their targets could effectively respond. The first PT boats arrived in the Philippines in September 1941, just months before Pearl Harbor. When war came, Lieutenant John Bulkeley's Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 3 fought desperately in the doomed defense of the islands. Though their early success claims proved exaggerated, the boats demonstrated their potential. In March 1942, Bulkeley's PT boats evacuated General Douglas MacArthur and his family from Corregidor through Japanese-controlled waters, a feat that captured American imagination during the darkest days of the war. But it was in the Solomon Islands campaign, beginning in August 1942, where PT boats truly proved their worth. When American Marines seized Guadalcanal and its vital airfield, they triggered a 6-month struggle for control of the island and surrounding waters. The Japanese response was predictable under their doctrine. They would reinforce Guadalcanal with troop and supply convoys escorted by destroyers and cruisers, operating primarily at night when American aircraft from Henderson Field could not interfere. This tactic became known as the Tokyo Express, or to the Japanese, the Rat Run. Fast destroyer convoys would race down the slot, the narrow channel between parallel island chains, deliver troops or supplies in darkness, and withdraw before dawn. It was efficient. It exploited Japanese superiority in night combat, and it was exactly the kind of operation for which Kantai Kessen had no real answer except to commit major fleet units to counterattacks. The Americans had a different solution. They deployed PT boats to Tulagi, a small island near Guadalcanal, and gave them a simple mission: hunt the Tokyo Express. Night after night, these wooden boats prowled Iron Bottom Sound, the waters between Guadalcanal, Savo Island, and Tulagi. They operated in small groups, using darkness and their low profiles to approach Japanese warships undetected. When they spotted enemy vessels, they would sprint to torpedo range, typically under 1,000 yards, launch their weapons, and escape at maximum speed while laying smoke screens. The Japanese initially dismissed reports of small boats attacking their destroyers. Their doctrine had trained them to watch for submarines, aircraft, and capital ships, not wooden speedboats. Japanese lookouts were expert at spotting the periscope wakes of submarines or the silhouettes of destroyers, but they were not prepared for the low-profile, high-speed approach of PT boats. Even when they detected the boats, Japanese commanders often misidentified them or underestimated their threat. The idea that a 50-ton wooden boat could endanger a 2,000-ton steel destroyer seemed absurd under the logic of Kantai Kessen. But the PT boats kept coming, and the results began to accumulate. On December 7, 1942, PT boats intercepted a Tokyo Express convoy and forced it to turn back without completing its mission. 5 days later, on December 11th, 3 PT boats attacked another destroyer convoy. In the darkness and confusion, Lieutenant Lester Gamble in PT-37, Lieutenant Stilly Taylor in PT-40, and Lieutenant William Kreiner in PT-48 closed to point-blank range and launched their torpedoes. The destroyer Teruzuki, a modern Akizuki-class vessel with advanced anti-aircraft systems, took 2 torpedo hits. The ship's rudder was destroyed, and within hours, the Teruzuki sank. 9 Japanese sailors died. More importantly, the convoy was disrupted, and Guadalcanal went without its supplies. This was asymmetric warfare at its most effective. 3 wooden boats, costing a fraction of what a destroyer cost, had sunk a major warship and accomplished a strategic objective. The Japanese had no doctrinal answer to this kind of combat. Kantai Kessen offered no guidance for how to defend supply convoys against small, fast boats operating in confined waters at night. The doctrine assumed such threats were irrelevant. The PT boats proved that assumption was catastrophically wrong. The Japanese failure to anticipate PT boat tactics was not a simple oversight. It was the inevitable result of institutional rigidity and doctrinal blindness that permeated the Imperial Japanese Navy from top to bottom. To understand this failure, we must examine what Japanese planners believed and why those beliefs proved so disastrously wrong. First, Japanese strategic thinking focused almost exclusively on major fleet units. The Naval General Staff in Tokyo spent decades planning for the decisive engagement with the American Pacific Fleet. They war-gamed scenarios involving carriers, battleships, and cruisers. They calculated optimal gun ranges, torpedo spreads, and carrier strike packages. In all these elaborate plans, small craft like motor torpedo boats were afterthoughts at best. When Japanese planners considered coastal defense or perimeter security, they thought in terms of destroyers, submarines, and land-based aircraft, not wooden boats with torpedo tubes. Second, the Japanese made assumptions about geography that seemed reasonable but proved wrong. They believed motor torpedo boats could not be effective in the heavy seas and vast distances of the Pacific. This was partly true. PT boats had limited range, about 500 miles at cruising speed, and they performed poorly in rough weather. But the Solomon Islands campaign was not fought in the open Pacific. It was fought in narrow channels, protected sounds, and coastal waters where PT boats could operate from nearby bases. The Japanese assumed the war would be fought on their terms, in their preferred battle space. When it was not, their doctrine offered no flexibility. Third, the Imperial Japanese Navy had little institutional experience with small craft warfare. Unlike the British Royal Navy, which had operated motor torpedo boats extensively in World War I, or the Italian Navy, which pioneered explosive motorboat tactics, Japan had largely ignored this category of vessel. The few torpedo boats Japan built were constrained by the Washington Naval Treaty limits and were designed more as small destroyers than true motor torpedo boats. When war came, Japan had no equivalent to the American PT boat, no doctrine for using such craft, and no experience in countering them. Fourth, there was a cultural element to this blindness. The Imperial Japanese Navy prided itself on its warrior spirit and its mastery of traditional naval warfare. Battleships and cruisers were the pride of the fleet, commanded by the Academy elite. Submarine service was less prestigious. Small boat operations were barely considered naval warfare at all. To suggest that wooden boats crewed by American reservists could threaten the Tokyo Express was to suggest that amateurs could defeat professionals, that improvisation could trump doctrine, that unconventional warfare could matter more than traditional might. This was psychologically difficult for Japanese officers trained in rigid hierarchy and traditional thinking to accept. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, the Japanese made critical errors in intelligence assessment. Early reports from Guadalcanal about PT boat attacks were often dismissed or minimized. When destroyers reported being attacked by small craft, headquarters sometimes attributed the attacks to submarines or misidentification. When PT boats did score hits, Japanese commanders often assumed the damage came from other sources. The sinking of the submarine I-3 by PT-59 on December 9, 1942, was initially attributed to air attack or mines. Only later did captured documents confirm the PT boat kill. This pattern of dismissing evidence that contradicted doctrine is perhaps the most damaging aspect of the Japanese failure. Even when PT boats proved effective, Japanese planners struggled to incorporate this reality into their thinking. The Naval General Staff never fundamentally revised its assessment of motor torpedo boat threats. Individual commanders in the Solomons learned to respect the PT boats and took precautions, but this knowledge never translated into systematic doctrinal change or strategic adaptation. The institutional commitment to Kantai Kessen was too deep, the investment in battleship-centered warfare too great, the psychological attachment to decisive battle too strong. By contrast, American naval leaders showed remarkable flexibility. When early PT boat operations revealed problems with Mark 8 torpedoes, which often ran too deep or failed to explode, The Navy worked to fix the problems and adapted tactics. When PT boats proved less effective against major warships than hoped, they were increasingly used against the Japanese barge traffic that supplied island garrisons. Boats were modified with additional guns, radar was added when available, and tactics evolved based on combat experience. The American approach was pragmatic. Use what works, fix what does not, adapt constantly. The Japanese approach remained dogmatic. Adhere to doctrine, assume the enemy will cooperate, and prepare for the decisive battle that never came. The reality of PT boat warfare in the Solomons was far removed from the clean abstractions of Japanese naval doctrine. It was desperate, confusing, terrifying, and effective. To understand how these wooden boats challenged Japanese destroyers, we must look at the actual mechanics of night combat in those dark waters. A typical PT boat mission began at dusk, when intelligence reports indicated a Tokyo express run was inbound. The boats would sortie from Tulagi in small groups, usually 2 to 4 boats operating together. They carried 3,000 gallons of aviation gasoline, enough for about 12 hours of patrol at cruising speed, but only about 4 hours at full throttle. The boats were unarmored, lightly built, and highly flammable. A single shell hit in the engine room could turn a PT boat into an inferno in seconds. The crews were young, often barely out of their teens, commanded by junior officers in their 20s. Most were naval reservists with minimal peacetime training. They learned their trade through experience, passed down from boat to boat, patrol to patrol. They learned to navigate by dead reckoning and star sights in waters that were poorly charted. They learned to identify Japanese vessels by silhouette in darkness. They learned to judge range without radar in the early months, when only a few boats had the new technology. As they patrolled, the PT boats would typically run at low speed with muffled exhausts, listening for the sound of approaching ships. Japanese destroyers could make 35 knots, but they created distinctive wakes and engine noise that trained American ears could detect. When contact was made, the PT boat commander had to make split-second decisions. Approach from what angle? How close before launching? Which target to engage if multiple ships were present? The ideal attack profile was to approach from ahead or from the beam, get within 1,000 yards, launch all 4 torpedoes in rapid succession, and immediately turn away while laying a smokescreen and accelerating to maximum speed. The Mark 8 torpedo ran at 36 knots with a range of 16,000 yards, but at close range, accuracy improved dramatically, and the enemy had less time to evade. The torpedoes left phosphorescent wakes that could give away the PT boat's position, so timing and surprise were crucial. Japanese destroyers had formidable defensive capabilities. They mounted multiple 5-inch guns, smaller anti-aircraft weapons, and searchlights. Their crews were trained for night combat and were often excellent shots. Once alerted, a destroyer could bring devastating fire to bear on a PT boat in seconds. American boat captains quickly learned that after launching torpedoes, the immediate priority was escape. Many attacks ended with PT boats zigzagging frantically through shell splashes, while enemy searchlights swept the water trying to fix them for accurate fire. The psychological strain was immense. Imagine piloting a wooden boat, laden with thousands of gallons of high-octane gasoline, toward a steel warship that outweighs you 40 to 1 and outguns you 100 to 1. You know that a single hit can kill you instantly. You know that if your boat catches fire, the flames will spread faster than you can jump overboard. You know that even if you survive being blown off the boat, you are in waters notorious for sharks. And yet you accelerate toward the enemy because that is the mission. Not every attack succeeded. Many torpedoes missed as Japanese destroyers maneuvered violently, or as PT boat crews misjudged range and deflection in darkness. The Mark 8 torpedo had significant reliability problems early in the war. Some ran too deep, passing harmlessly under shallow draft barges. Some failed to explode on impact due to faulty detonators. Some ran circular, endangering the very boats that launched them. American crews learned to accept that even a perfectly executed attack might yield no results due to mechanical failure. But enough attacks succeeded to matter. The PT boat sank the destroyer Teruzuki on December 11, 1942. They sank the submarine I-3 on December 9th. They damaged numerous other warships and forced Japanese convoys to abort missions or divert routes. More importantly, they created a persistent threat that complicated every Japanese operation in the Solomons. Tokyo Express commanders had to worry not just about American aircraft and submarines, but also about small boats that could appear from any direction in darkness. The Japanese response to this threat revealed the limitations of their doctrine. Individual destroyer captains learned to be more cautious, to increase speed when approaching Guadalcanal, to maintain better lookout discipline, to illuminate suspected PT boat locations with flares. But at the strategic level, the Imperial Japanese Navy never developed an effective countertactic. They never built their own motor torpedo boats in significant numbers for the Solomons. They never deployed specialized anti-PT boat vessels. They never fundamentally reconsidered their night supply operations in light of the PT boat threat. Instead, they persisted with the Tokyo Express because it was the only option compatible with their overall strategy, even as PT boats made those runs increasingly costly and unreliable. By February 1943, the Japanese decided to evacuate Guadalcanal. The decision was driven by many factors: the inability to neutralize Henderson Field, unsustainable losses in ships and aircraft, and the failure of the land campaign. But among those factors was the simple reality that the Japanese could no longer reliably supply their forces on the island. PT boats were not the only reason for this failure, but they were a significant contributing factor. Wooden boats crewed by reservists had helped choke off the supply line to an entire Japanese army. The Japanese failure to anticipate PT boat tactics was not an isolated error. It was part of a broader pattern of doctrinal rigidity and strategic inflexibility that characterized the Imperial Japanese Navy throughout the Pacific War. Understanding this pattern helps explain why Japan, which began the war with tactical and operational advantages, ultimately lost so decisively. The fundamental problem was that Kantai Kessen doctrine assumed a short war decided by a single climactic engagement. This assumption shaped everything from ship design to logistics planning to personnel policy. Japanese battleships like Yamato were optimized for one perfect battle, not for sustained operations. Japanese naval air training produced elite pilots through intensive programs, but when those pilots were lost, there was no effective replacement pipeline. Japanese logistical planning focused on offensive operations, not on the defensive convoy protection that became critical as the war turned against them. When the war did not conform to these assumptions, when it became instead a grinding campaign of attrition across thousands of miles of ocean and hundreds of islands, Japanese doctrine offered little guidance. The Naval General Staff proved remarkably unable to adapt. They continued to seek the decisive engagement even after Midway made clear that carrier aviation, not battleship gunnery, would determine naval superiority. They continued to prioritize offensive operations even when defensive consolidation would have been wiser. They continued to husband their fleet for the perfect moment, even as that fleet was slowly eroded by submarine attacks, airstrikes, and logistical failure. The PT boat experience exemplified this institutional inflexibility. Here was a clear tactical problem with obvious solutions. The Japanese could have built their own fast attack craft, developed better anti-small boat tactics, deployed specialized patrol vessels, or adapted their supply methods. Some of these solutions were attempted in limited ways, but none were pursued with the urgency and resources that might have made a difference. The reason was doctrinal. Small boat warfare simply did not fit into the framework of decisive battle theory. This inflexibility extended to intelligence assessment and learning from experience. American forces in the Pacific constantly adapted based on combat results. They learned from their mistakes at Savo Island and subsequent naval battles, developing better night fighting tactics, improving radar fire control, and refining damage control procedures. They learned from PT boat operations, shifting emphasis from attacking major warships to targeting supply barges when that proved more effective. They learned from submarine operations, fixing torpedo problems, and developing better wolfpack tactics. Japanese learning, by contrast, was slower and less systematic. Individual commanders gained tactical proficiency through experience, but institutional learning was limited. The Naval General Staff in Tokyo remained somewhat disconnected from frontline realities. Doctrine manuals were not systematically updated based on combat experience. After-action reports were sometimes filed, but not always analyzed for broader lessons. There was a cultural reluctance to admit fundamental errors or to question decisions made by senior officers. The contrast is striking in the realm of technology and innovation. American forces rapidly adopted new technologies like radar, proximity fuses, and improved torpedoes, integrating them into doctrine and tactics. Japanese forces were slower to adopt radar and never achieved the same level of integration. Japanese torpedoes remained technologically impressive, but were not manufactured in sufficient quantities, and Japanese submarine doctrine never fully exploited their potential. The long-lance torpedo was a superweapon for surface ship duels, but it was less useful for the kind of war Japan actually had to fight. Personnel policy reflected the same rigidity. The Japanese Navy trained excellent officers through the Naval Academy at Itajima, but this system produced too few leaders and was too inflexible to adapt to the rapid expansion of the wartime fleet. The emphasis on perfection through intensive training meant that when experienced pilots and crew were lost, they could not be quickly replaced. The American approach of accepting adequate training for most personnel while providing intensive specialized training for specific roles proved more sustainable in a long war. Perhaps most fundamentally, Japanese strategic culture struggled with the concept of fighting a limited war for limited objectives. The Kantai Kessen doctrine assumed total victory through decisive battle. When that victory did not materialize, there was no fallback plan, no concept of how to fight a defensive war of attrition, no strategy for extracting acceptable terms from a conflict that was going badly. The decision to evacuate Guadalcanal in February 1943 was agonizing for Japanese leaders precisely because it represented abandonment of the decisive battle mentality. From that point forward, Japan was strategically on the defensive, reacting to American initiatives, and the Kantai Kessen doctrine offered no guidance for this situation. The PT boats, in their small way, symbolized everything wrong with Japanese strategic thinking. They represented asymmetric warfare, tactical innovation, flexible adaptation, and the kind of grinding attritional combat that Doctrine dismissed as irrelevant. That wooden boats crewed by young reservists could matter in the largest naval war in history should have been impossible according to the logic of Kantai Kessen. That they did matter, that they contributed to the strangulation of Guadalcanal and the larger Japanese defeat in the Solomons proved that the doctrine itself was fundamentally flawed. The story of PT boats versus Japanese destroyers is more than a tale of tactical surprise. It is a meditation on the danger of fighting the war you planned instead of the war you face. The Imperial Japanese Navy entered World War II as one of the most formidable naval forces in history. Its ships were well designed, its crews were superbly trained, its doctrine was refined through decades of study and practice. Yet within 4 years, that mighty fleet was destroyed. Not in the glorious decisive battle its admirals had anticipated, but through 1,000 cuts in scattered actions across the Pacific. Submarines stalked Japanese convoys, aircraft carriers struck from beyond the horizon, and yes, wooden patrol boats harassed supply runs in contested waters, chipping away at logistics and morale. The Japanese never imagined that American PT boats would attack at 40 knots because imagination itself was constrained by doctrine. They had a theory of how wars should be fought, and they assumed the enemy would cooperate with that theory. When the Americans did not cooperate, when they instead waged asymmetric warfare using unconventional tactics and adaptive innovation, the Japanese institutional structure struggled to respond. There is a deeper truth here about military organizations and strategic thinking. Doctrine is necessary, training is essential, planning is vital. But all these things can become traps if they are not tempered by flexibility, humility, and the willingness to question fundamental assumptions. The Japanese Navy's commitment to Kantai Kessen was so complete that it blinded them to alternatives. They could not see the PT boats coming because their entire worldview told them such vessels did not matter. History is filled with similar failures. The French army in 1940 believed the next war would resemble World War I and built the Maginot Line accordingly. The German High Command in 1944 believed that strategic bombing could not defeat them and failed to adequately prepare their homeland air defenses. The American military in the early 21st century believed in conventional warfare between state actors and struggled to adapt to insurgency and asymmetric threats. In each case, doctrine shaped perception and perception shaped response, and the gap between expectation and reality proved costly. The PT boats of the Solomon Islands campaign ultimately faded from the front lines as the war moved beyond their operational range and as larger, more powerful vessels became available. Many were scrapped after the war. their wooden hulls unsuitable for long-term storage. But their legacy endured. They proved that small, fast, innovative systems could matter in modern warfare. They demonstrated the value of tactical flexibility over doctrinal purity. They showed that warriors willing to close with the enemy in fragile boats, armed with courage and torpedoes, could influence the course of history. Today, the waters of Iron Bottom Sound are quiet. The wrecks of dozens of ships rest on the seafloor. Japanese and American vessels mingled in the mud. The destroyer Teruzuki lies there still, discovered by underwater explorers in 2025, its stern severed, testimony to the torpedo strikes that sank it 83 years ago. Those waters remember the roar of PT boat engines, the flash of 5-inch guns, the phosphorescent trails of torpedoes in darkness. And perhaps they remember too the fundamental lesson that wars are not won by following a perfect plan, but by adapting when the plan fails, by seeing clearly what is rather than what doctrine says should be, by recognizing that the enemy gets a vote in how the war is fought. The Japanese destroyers never imagined the devil boats because they were not trained to imagine beyond the decisive battle. That failure of imagination, multiplied across thousands of decisions and engagements, helped determine the outcome of the Pacific War. In the end, the wooden boats mattered, not because they sank the most ships or inflicted the most damage, but because they represented a different way of thinking about warfare. They were improvisation against doctrine, innovation against tradition, flexibility against rigidity. And in the darkness of Iron Bottom Sound, on those desperate nights when young Americans raced their plywood boats toward steel destroyers, they proved that sometimes the unconventional approach, the unexpected tactic, the weapon dismissed by doctrine, can change everything. The thunder in the dark was not the sound of the decisive battle. It was the sound of a different kind of war entirely, one that the Imperial Japanese Navy had never imagined they would have to fight.